welcome back to 7:30.
Thanks very much.
What did you want your audience today to hear from Sam Altman?
Well, the whole day was set up to bring together more than 1,000 of our clients, many institutional and business customers who are thinking about implementing AI. It's really about sharing practical experiences. That was the course of the day, but Sam was kind enough to join us this morning from the US on a public holiday, and we covered a lot of ground. And you touched on one of the points that he mentioned, and he also talked a little bit about how he was surprised that enterprise adoption was running slower, and that's what led to his comment that actually he sort of changed his views and forecasts, and I think also acknowledged a lot of the uncertainty that exists. And I think that's an important message as well, to be prepared but not necessarily alarmed.
Now, as I said at the beginning, at the same time, there are very different views amongst that the peak of the AI leaders. One of them, Dario Amodei from Anthropic, describes a reasonably near universe when you have a huge productivity growth from AI at 10%, but accompanied by large-scale unemployment. Is that also something we should prepare for at the same time?
Yeah, look, Dario's been outspoken around scenarios like that. I must say, the little that I do know him, I've met him a few times, I do think he's genuine and he's sincere. It probably doesn't hurt, though, in the backdrop when you're raising funding to be thinking about overall the benefits. But, look, to be clear, if we got a significant boost in GDP, that would be great from an output perspective. If that was accompanied by a very large increase in unemployment, that would not be success. And I think that's why it's so important to be thinking about some of those longer term issues, and particularly how to prepare, in our case, our people or our employees, but also I think more broadly. And I think there is a transition that's underway, and hopefully that can be done in advance and can be done well and responsibly.
One of the issues here, the current government, for example, talks about the importance of Australians having a stake in the economy. But that version, the more extreme version, but also supported by other people in the industry, suggests a world where a lot of people don't have a direct stake in the economy. Now, whichever version it is, what do you do about that if a lot of people lose their positions, their roles, and no longer have the same involvement in the economy, in the community they had before?
Yeah, look, I think it's very difficult. And I would say I think very few people know with any level of certainty what's going to happen in 12 months as it relates to those forecasts, most of which have been wrong, and even more so over 10 years. But I think what is known, though, is we're going through a period of rapid change. We're seeing a technology that's very significant. It's significant on a global basis. I don't think it's the right strategy to just, delay and hope that it goes away. I think there has to be a lot of, thoughtfulness and preparation. I don't think making people anxious about the future is a good strategy. Doesn't get the best out of people.
It's a difficult balance, isn't it? Straight talking versus making people so concerned they don't make good decisions.
Sure, no, I think that's right. What we've seen, certainly in the Australian economy, is relatively few roles or jobs impacted by AI at this point, but a lot of changes underneath that, particularly at the task and the skill level. I know that was something we touched on last time we spoke, and so I think that will continue, but that also gives people an understanding, well, if the job that I'm in is actually changing, I can change with it, I can learn new skills, I can think about the skills that are ahead of me, but I don't want to make that sound easier than it is. Of course, the pace of change will matter, but yes, I think it's important to try to be clear. I don't think you protect people by not talking about the things that you think are happening and giving them the chance to take some agency and build better resilience for themselves.
One of the things that Altman talked to you about today was his realisation that people didn't like receiving his AI-written emails. They actually wanted to hear from him. So how do you decide which jobs it is that humans must continue to do? This is a little bit the conversation we had before, but I'm wondering if your thinking has developed. How do you figure out which is the AI email that you don't want? You don't want your emails written by AI.
Yeah, I thought that answer was interesting. I sort of asked him about how he was using AI, and he flipped around and said how he wasn't. I actually think there's a lot of different roles, and what we're seeing, as I said, the tasks are changing, but often the criticality of the human judgment and the importance of that is actually growing. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that sending of an email is the most critical thing that many people do in their role. But the point he was trying to make was that it feels, even though the agent or the machine can do that, it feels wrong to be doing that. There's something quite human about communicating, even in writing, let alone in speaking. And I gave the same sort of example that I was in regional Queensland recently with one of our regional agri bankers driving out to see a client. I mean, realistically, there will not be a MacBook going out to visit one of our clients in regional Queensland anytime soon. So
presuming someone goes out to visit someone.
Yes, but I mean, I do think that's still a very important part of both our service proposition. I think what we'll see is that people will still really value a lot of the human connection. I think, in a better scenario, there is more of a migration to higher value work. Your judgment, problem solving, the ability to communicate clearly, empathy. They're the sorts of skills that are still going to be very highly valued, and it should be humans that are driving the machines, not the other way around. I think that was at least one of the things that I saw in the Pope's message.
So I wanted to ask you about safety as well, because that's obviously at the forefront of everyone's minds, and clearly it's at the forefront of a bank in making the big decisions, the big investments that you're making in AI at the moment. So all of the AI leaders acknowledge that they don't really understand why AI models do some of the things that they do, that AI agents might have goals even beyond, will have goals, are very likely to have goals beyond that which we have given them. Now that sounds deeply incompatible with banking. How much does that aspect of how AI is developing, how much does that trouble you about your use of AI?
Yeah, look, the latter part of your question, the models that are publicly available are not in that category. But to your point, they're probabilistic, which means that they are not, going to be perfect all of the time. So you have to build a lot of safeguards and guardrails around that. Often, basically making sure that you're checking, and there's different technologies that you can use to do that. But then also, I think one of the things, again, this has to be a human task. Really what you're doing is making sure you understand objectively in real time, well, what's the evaluation criteria? How are you monitoring that? How are you detecting? And then how do you remedy anything? And it has to be a very fast feedback loop. So it's actually, I guess, a different way of designing a system. And it's a very important role for a human. And even though people talk a lot, and it's true, like engineering or software development is very automated. It's really, though, the humans that are setting the architecture, the overall solution, that are driving some of that automation. And what we're seeing is actually, people can be very productive, which means that they're very valuable, and would be compensated as such.
All right, let's move on to the budget. We've been hearing how it's been going, how the debate's been going on in Canberra today. On this programme earlier this year, you said you were in favour of reducing the CGT discount as long as the changes were grandfathered. So do you endorse the CGT changes in the budget?
So a few quick things, and I'll get straight to CGT, I think, which really stand out in the budget and worth maybe just briefly mentioning. Firstly, the context in which we're operating in, not just the technology that we've been talking about, but a completely changed geopolitical and strategic environment. What does that mean? It means we've got much higher sort of costs around defence, resilience. We've got some structural issues as well in terms of demographic and ageing population. We are in a structural deficit, which means our expenses, exceed our revenue. I think the government have looked at that, and look, you could make a case to say that actually Australia's debt at a government level is one of the lowest of advanced economies. I think they're doing the right thing by reducing some of the pressures on the budget from a fiscal perspective for a couple of reasons. One, we both know that that's effectively a tax on future generations. And secondly, you lose degrees of freedom to be able to respond to a shock. And it used to be ballpark every 10 years there'd be a shock. Now they're much more frequent. And I think we should plan for that. So then specifically to get to your question, you have to look at both the context, The expenditure profile, I think the majority of the budget repair was really done in the work in the NDIS, which will be difficult.
Yep.
And definitely has some execution risk, but the government should be, I think, called out for that. And then you get into some of the other revenue measures. And look, overall, again,
Here I am waiting for the answer.
I know, I'll get to it quickly.
Yep.
I mean, as it comes to taxation, we tax labour or
and you've said before, too much tax on labour, not enough tax on capital.
Consumption, lightly, wealth.
So do you endorse the CGT changes in the budget?
I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong, and I would support changes to CGT, and as I described it at the time, between moving or reducing the discount. Now this is going back to the indexation. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, although I'd make the distinction, which understandably there's a lot of focus. There's a big difference in my mind between sort of passive asset accumulation versus productive capital or risk taking. And this is on the latter category, this is clearly something the government are looking at closely.
So should it have just been for housing?
Well, I think they've announced the policy. It's obviously very clean if it's only for housing. I think when you when you get into all asset classes, because you're trading off simplicity, I think we've got to be careful. And obviously, as I said, the government have announced that they're looking at that very carefully between it. Look, if I'm just accumulating an asset and I'm passively holding that versus I'm investing in a startup, a founder, a business, a junior explorer. I think that's quite different. And I don't think we want to change the incentives towards risk and enterprise and innovation in this country too much.
What you are saying is that the government should change what it's done when it comes to other investments, to shares or investments in I think companies beyond just startups.
Again, I'd make the distinction more around the passive asset accumulation versus growth and productive risk capital. I think they're looking closely at that. They've obviously talked already about startups and small business and that.
You think it should go further?
Well, I mean, I'll leave it to them where they draw that line, but clearly, that category will be very much on their mind. But
have you talked to the Treasurer about it?
No, not since the budget, no.
Will you?
I'm sure I will at some point. I'm planning on being down in Canberra in the next couple of weeks.
And what will you tell him?
Well, I think substantially similar to what...
So they should, to be clear, just to wrap up there, that they should reconsider applying CGT to those other areas beyond passive investment in housing.
I think that's the area that you've got to look at. And again, though, this is a step where I do think wealth, relative particularly to labour and even to consumption, is taxed lightly and inconsistently. And if you go back to the same, if there's an expectation which Australia has for the services that we currently enjoy, we don't want to add to the fiscal situation and a tax on future generations, then clearly we've got to get the balance right between what's the growth profile, how do we broaden the tax base, how do we make it as fair and efficient as possible. And these are hard choices. I mean, clearly any changes in and around tax were never going to be popular, and understandably. So these are very finely calibrated decisions, but against that backdrop where there are some real constraints there.
And you think the government should look at altering the way they have levied this the way they are planning?
Well, I mean, they've already announced that they're reviewing.
You want them to go further than just taking startups?
Well, I think that's the area where there is, I think, as they've acknowledged, the greatest sort of focus and scrutiny. I think the negative gearing changes are less controversial. So it would make sense to me that they would focus and look at that. I'm sure they'll be inundated with opportunities for engagement from multiple sectors.
And a little bit of Matt Comyn into the picture now too. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you.